Hi, I'm Pastor Jason. Today we're going to talk about how you can share your faith in conversation, in relationships with people all around you, and how your small group can be a support system for that, how you can all learn together and grow in this important skill together. And to start, I want you to consider a quote that I read somewhere about our society's view of truth. It said, as we look to arrive at a clear answer, the line between right and wrong, black and white, has been blurred to such a degree that there are no longer discernible differences. It's such a fundamental aspect of our beliefs that lying is a crime while truth morally prevails. But what is true for one individual may not be true to the majority. And whether you agree with this way of thinking or not, does it ring true for you? Does it ring true as a description of our society? Does it show itself in your interactions, in your conversations? Feel free to pause the video for a minute and spend a few minutes talking with your group about this idea, about how you see it at work. Most of us can think of a situation or an experience that fits that mold. And that's because this is exactly the culture that we live in. And that can feel like a barrier to sharing our faith. Today we're going to talk about how to navigate that dynamic. And there's a strong scriptural example to help us think about that. Listen to these words from Acts 17. It's verses 16 to 32. Paul is in Athens and he confronts a situation very similar to the one we just described, the kind of society that we live in. You can pause the video and turn there if you want to read along, or you can just listen as I read. Acts 17, starting with verse 16. Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him, as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities," because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the object of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness, by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." Now let's consider a few specific details about this passage that will help us think about Paul's strategy and how it might be helpful for us. First, the marketplace. The marketplace was an important setting for more than commerce. It was also a setting for discussing ideas, which verse 21 suggests was an important cultural pastime for the Athenians. It's the place to go for conversations like this one. At the same time, Paul had a specific reason for being in the marketplace. Listen to these two passages. First, Acts 18, 1 through 3, which says, "After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade." And Acts 20, 33 and 34, this is Paul speaking. He says, "I coveted no one's silver or gold or apparel. You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my necessities and to those who were with me." Paul used his tent making to support his ministry. And so while there is no direct evidence that in this text that Paul was selling tents in that specific situation in Athens, it suggests at least that Paul's sole purpose in the marketplace was not proselytizing or evangelizing. So these two passages show us Paul was a tent maker, and he used that tent making to support himself and his ministry. That means at some point he was selling tents. We don't have any specific evidence that Paul was selling tents in the marketplace in Athens, but at the very least he was a businessman, a man of commerce. The marketplace then was a natural setting for him, a place where he had reason to be, and where other people would not have been surprised or put off to find him. That's the place where Paul chooses to have this conversation about Jesus, this faith conversation, a place that's natural for him, where he has a good reason to be. There's an important principle for us here. The places where we engage in faith conversation should be places that are natural for us, places where we have a good reason to be. Take a minute to think about that on your own. What are the marketplace settings in your life? What are the places where you naturally have reason to be and find yourself around many other people who would be comfortable with seeing you there? The next thing I want us to think about is the idea of reasoning, the thing Luke, the writer of Acts, says Paul is doing with the people in the marketplace. The word he uses for reasoning is specific and has a slightly different meaning from our understanding of that word. When we talk about reasoning, we usually mean something like trying to convince someone, trying to convince them of the virtue or the rightness of our position. But we also know that doesn't really work, especially when it comes to faith conversations. The interaction Paul is engaged in is different from that. The activity of the Athenians hints at what form it takes. Look again at verse 21. It says they spent their time doing nothing but discussing new ideas, all kinds of new ideas. That's what reasoning was, discussing one's own ideas in concert with a symphony of other new ideas. This is important because it's the mode of our culture too. All ideas swimming in the same pool. Paul puts his idea into the mix. We can too. At the same time, though, even as he's letting his idea swim with all the others, his viewpoint is clear. That's the next point for us. Look again at verse 18. Luke writes, "Others said he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because, as Luke adds, he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." While Paul is putting his view out there among the others, it's clear to those who are listening what he's talking about. Jesus and the resurrection. Letting other views stand beside our own does not mean we have to hide or soft pedal or water down what we believe. This also shows us something important about how we can engage with others. The content of Paul's message as he interacts with people in the marketplace is not theology, and it's definitely not moral values. It's not how they should behave. It's the good news of Jesus. Likewise, our primary mode of engaging, especially with those who are not yet believers, should be the good news of Jesus, rather than theology, debating or arguing it, or certainly correcting their morals or behavior. Paul shows us an important skill while he's waiting for the invitation that ultimately comes. Look at verse 22 and 23. When the invitation to talk about his beliefs comes, Paul is able to begin the conversation with the words, "I see that in every way you are very religious." He even notes one particular statue. Now, how would he have discerned that? Because he has spent time learning about the Athenians. By taking the time to learn and communicating what he has learned in an affirming way, Paul accomplishes two things. First, he demonstrates genuine interest in their point of view. And secondly, he finds common ground with them. Take a moment in your group and talk about this. How can we learn about those around us and their culture, what's important to them, what they value, while we watch for openings for spiritual conversation? Feel free to pause the video if you need a minute to talk. Okay, so how then do we put our view into the mix? How can we operate like Paul, sharing the good news of Jesus in a way that's recognizable to those around us without being too authoritative too quickly? What I want to share with you now as a framework you can use in your marketplaces, in those places you naturally find yourself, where you have the opportunity to interact with others. Now, this is a framework. It's not a process or a formula. You don't have to feel bound by it or work hard to get it exactly right. It's just a tool for you to have in your head, something to lean on as you navigate spiritual conversations. After we talk about each part, I'm going to ask you to pause and to talk about it with your group. Here we go. As you're interacting with people, listen for the breakdown. We don't live in a culture or find ourselves in settings where people spend all their time doing nothing but discussing new ideas, as Luke said about the people of Athens. But our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues are looking for something new. And the best part is, they will tell you what they're looking for. They'll tell you when they're looking for a new idea. You can listen for it by listening for the breakdown. By the breakdown, we mean the comment that says their worldview, that is, their way of looking at the world, doesn't answer a question that's important to them, or doesn't give them a satisfying answer to that question. It won't necessarily sound spiritual, but it will sound like a need, a desire, a confusion. Here are some examples I've heard in conversations. I wish I had a moral foundation for my kids. Something's missing there. I wonder what will happen to me when I die. Maybe it's as simple as something is missing in my life. Can you recall any conversations, recent or distant, when someone said something to you that may have been a breakdown moment, indicating they were looking for an answer to an important question? Pause the video and share some with your group. When you hear the breakdown comment, you'll know you've come to a moment when your friend is looking for something new. The next part of the framework is to ask lots of good, open-ended questions. Questions like, what do you mean by that? Can you tell me more about this or that part of it? Two things are happening when you do that, when you ask those good, open-ended questions. First, it gives you time to gather your thoughts and make sure you really know what it is your friend is looking for. Second, you are earning the right to be heard by letting them speak first. What are some of the best questions you've been asked? The ones that really allowed you to open up and share your story. Share them with your group so all of you can put them in your toolbox for later conversations. When you've come across the breakdown comment, the thing that says your friend's worldview isn't fully working for them, as you're asking questions and listening, start to ask yourself, what would be good news for this person? What would be attractive, helpful, or uplifting for them? To get there, you can ask yourself the following questions. You might ask, what helps me through moments like this? Or what would Jesus want this person to know? What would my pastor say to me if I brought him this problem? Or what does the Bible say about this need or this question that's inviting and attractive? So that's part 3 of the framework. Ask yourself, what would be good news for this person? And then finally, when you're ready to share something good, this is the 4th piece of the framework, frame it in a personal way. Remember, assertions don't work well in the marketplace. Because we live in a many-truths culture, assertions of truth aren't well received. Instead, frame your good news as an I statement. Here's some examples. Maybe you could say, when I feel that way, one thing that really helps me is whatever it might be. Or you might say, something I lean on is. So that's the framework you can use to navigate a faith conversation. Listen for the breakdown. That's how you'll know an opportunity is there for a spiritual conversation, even if the specific thing your friend says isn't spiritual. Ask lots of good questions to gain trust and get to the heart of the issue. While you're doing that, start to ask yourself, what would sound like good news for that situation or that need? Then share that good news using an I statement. It's not an exact science or a recipe to follow. You can be flexible, but it's a map that you can use to help you. Now, as we finish up, I want to end with a note on how to know when to go deeper. The roadmap we've talked about so far only really gets a toe in the water. One piece of good news. How do we know when it's a good idea to do what Paul does in the second half of that passage, where he's telling exactly the Athenians what they should believe? How do you know when you have moved from marketplace to Areopagus. The Areopagus is different from the marketplace. The Areopagus denotes a group of men who were the gatekeepers of ideas in Athens. New ideas needed to be approved by this group. This is the forum for Paul to speak directly and authoritatively. Look at verse 24 again. That's exactly what he does. From here, Paul becomes very direct about not only his beliefs, but what the Athenians should believe as well. What motivates this transition? Well, it's because he gets invited to the Areopagus. Paul's invitation sounds like, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. That's verse 19. For us, it will sound similar. Some variation of, I would like to know more. It might sound something like, do you have a Bible that I can read? Or, should I be baptized? Whatever it sounds like, that's your clue that it's now safe to go deeper, to be direct, to speak authoritatively. When you hear something like that, a question or a comment that invites more, you can go for it. Until then, just keep sharing pieces of good news when the opportunity arises naturally. That counts. When we talk about outreach or evangelism or faith sharing, that's what it is. Sharing pieces of good news and taking the opportunity to go deeper when it comes. You can do this. Jesus is with you. Good luck.